Welcome back to co-teaching in the middle school and high school math classroom. This section really is focusing on co-teaching. We'll be defining the roles and responsibilities, looking at the co-teaching models, but we'll also be talking about the behind the scenes, the planning, and the creation of this co-teaching team. During our introduction, we talked about having the guided notes. Please have them printed out next to you so that you can participate in the activities, as well as capture some of the important pieces of content that we'll be sharing with you today. There will be a place, just in case you've set aside your welcome page, where you can capture the second password code phrase to help keep you on track with where we are in the guided notes, as well as the presentation. There's going to be a nice bright green, really bright green page number that'll help you go to the right section of the guided notes. There's only 4 pages in the guided notes, and so we should be able to keep aligned. Teaching Exceptional Children published an article that talked about in the math classroom and the co-teaching practices. When we can integrate research-based instructional practices in mathematics and partner that with co-teaching, we create this very powerful environment that enables all students to develop mathematical understanding. That's our ultimate goal. And so that's why we're talking about co-teaching in the math classroom. And then we're really going to be focusing on middle school and high school. Dr. Marilyn Friend, who is kind of the guru, she actually defines co-teaching through these 4 bullets, which I found very easy to understand. Co-teaching is a service delivery model, mechanism. It is where 2 professionals with equivalent licensures or employment status come together and work in the same environment. It is based on parity. We have shared responsibility for the group of all students they serve. And again, in that shared workspace where students are not pulled out, generally not pulled out. So there are exceptions to the rules where they go to a separate location. So you're in a single location. There's also another co-teaching definition that I found very, very helpful within that article from Teaching Exceptional Children, where it talks about it being that instructional delivery model. But it's applicable to teaching students with disabilities. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about this later. There are other co-teaching teams besides the general ed and the special education teacher, but we're going to be focusing much of today on this co-teaching model where we pair up one general education teacher and one special education teacher. We're going to put this in the least restricted environment, and we're going to be sharing the responsibilities for planning, delivery, and evaluating instructional practices for all students. So that's how we're defining between the 2 of those definitions. That's how we're defining it today. Why? Well, approximately 5 to 8% of students experience learning disabilities in mathematics. And that's high numbers when we think of the number of students that pass through our math classroom. We know that we have struggling students, but then we also have another degree of struggle, which is students with learning disabilities. Like I said earlier, co-teaching, the most common partnership is between our gen ed and our special education teachers. But the other partnerships that exist that we want to make sure that that there's a lot of good information within this module that could apply to partnerships between gen ed and ESL or ELL, gen ed and interventionists in the math and the reading. Specialists such as teachers that come in to do arts integration and technology. That partnership still needs that. Those parity signals still need to be in existence there. And then in some instances, due to funding and creative, where we have paraprofessionals. So the first activity on page 1, as you see there, you have that nice bright green page number identifying. Go to your guided notes, and there is a section where you can rotate your page and you can fill this out. The reason why we want you to fill this out is because part of beginning this partnership is sharing information about yourself, sharing your unique expertise so that your partner can then, both of you guys can respect that and nurture that. So take some time, hit pause, fill this out, and we'll come back in a second. Well, in a few minutes. Okay, now that we're back, keep this in a nice, safe location because we want to make sure that you do have some conversations. Share this. If your co-teaching partner has not been able to participate in this particular session, maybe make a second copy of this or write this down on a separate sheet of paper and just hand it to them and have that shared conversation. The other resources that are very powerful when you're developing a partnership is understanding the roles and responsibilities. We'll dive a little bit deeper into this in a second, but in this book, 30 Days to the Co-Taught Classroom, there are so many activities that are rich in helping you to develop this true co-teaching team. One that we highly recommend is the co-teaching roles and responsibilities checklist. There are things that you might not even think about until in the moment, but you want to make sure everyone knows whose responsibility and what are the individual responsibilities as well as what are the shared responsibilities. And the other piece we're going to share with you is what message does your co-teaching team send to others, especially students. In this book, The 30 Days to the Co-Taught Classroom, Dr. Paula Kluth and Dr. Julie Costin, they give you a list of different ways to include parity signals. Now, when we talk about parity signals, we're really talking about the visual, the verbal, instructional signs designed to convey equity. That's how it's defined. And so some examples could be putting both of your names on the board, the door, on the papers, whatever you hand out to signal where the information is coming from. It should include both of your names. Routinely talking to your students. Students have this misconception. And so talking with students about who is in the classroom and what your, I guess for lack of a better word, is what your credentials are. It's about what are your specialties. What can you bring to making that classroom the best learning environment? And so we need just to be very explicit. Students really don't know unless you explain to them what your role is. So just make sure that when we think about our communication with students as well as other parents, that everyone is involved in knowing you. Ensuring both teachers are entering into the electronic gradebook. That is another piece because you're both responsible for the learning, and as well as creating a hybrid name for your team. We talk about this one just because creating that environment that we're all in it together. So team names are fun, but make sure that it's something that is a mixture of both of your personalities. I put this illusion in here because I think it's important when we move into parity signals. Do you think each one of these figures are the same size? That's what we're talking about as far as parity signals. The perspective of the student might believe that one is more in charge than the other. And in a true co-teaching team, that is not the case. So now we want to take your perspective and we want to capture not only what it looks like, but what it sounds like in a co-teaching environment. What does it look like from your perspective? And as well as what are the barriers to effective co-teaching? Pause and then come back. Now that you're back, I just want to share with you when we've worked with teachers in the past about what are the barriers to effective co-teaching. This is really eye-opening because we know this. 90% of the or more had this down on their papers, but it was time to plan. When we think of great instruction and great achievement from John O'Connor, He talks about in a classroom to make impact in learning, we need to increase engagement, especially with students with disabilities. We need to increase the opportunities for practice and opportunities to receive feedback. Well, what better place to do that is when we increase the number of educators in the classroom. And so we reduce the teacher student ratio. This is wonderful. Yes, we all should be in this co-teaching environment. Well, the problem with this is that we're making the assumption that we're actually providing engaging opportunities from all the educators. And so he also goes further into saying when you have two teachers in the classroom, you should see small group instruction routinely. That will drive the increased opportunities for engagement and feedback. Each of our teachers really need to be leading these small groups where we're having instructional activities going on. It's not about monitoring. There's going to be a time and a place for monitoring, but when in the grand scheme of the day, when you have two teachers in the classroom, you need to both be engaged with the students. And so that's something that when you think of your perspective of co-teaching, you might have been living in or experienced a one teach, one assist, or one teach, one observe. We're really not going to be focusing on either one of those because they're overused to the detriment of increasing engagement and opportunities to respond and feedback. So these are the four models that we're going to be focused on today. We're going to be looking at station teaching, parallel teaching, alternative teaching, and teaming. Defining them really is very simple. When you have station teaching, you're going to be having students, in the past, you would be having students rotate through. Now, what we want to be thinking about now is in this enlightenment of technology and trying to keep students safe, we need to be thinking about how can we still incorporate station teaching without risking safety. So now instead of the students moving to different stations, think about how you as the teachers can be moving and meeting with the students in that safe environment and providing an opportunity for students to work at their location safely. For parallel teaching, we have the same thing. We literally have two different classrooms per se set up where our students are facing us and we're teaching the same lesson, the same content, but we're just having a smaller group. So it does increase opportunities to respond because instead of one person, we've got multiple students, and that is ultimately the goal, is that we're monitoring all responses. When we talk about alternative teaching, it is pretty much what we think of as that small group intense instruction and large group instruction. Keep in mind that large groups complete the planned lessons while the smaller group might be working on an alternative, but same general content, same purpose. So that's alternative teaching. And then finally, and back to, I just want to make sure that we understand that alternative teaching, that small group instruction is fluid. So depending on the feedback you get from students will determine who is coming back and working in that small group instruction. And then finally, we have teaming. Teaming is really where both teachers are delivering the same instruction, same time. So it's knowing each other and taking turns teaching the same time, almost in setting up a signal where you're shoulder to shoulder teaching. So those are the four structures. Now, what does it look like in a math classroom? So that article we talked about, which the link is in the introduction portion of the welcome page, Creating Optimal Opportunities to Learn Mathematics, explains each one of these models inside and out. It actually explains the other two as well. It refers to the one teach, one assist as one teach, one drift. It gives math examples. The second article is actually in the next section. So that link is the benefits of co-teaching in the secondary math classes. And Misty's going to dive into that a lot deeper. So I just wanted to make sure that you have both of those. Take the time to read them, highlight, share them with your team. We want to look at next the challenges of a co-teaching partnership. And not only from your perspective, but what about administrator perspectives? But keep your guided notes next to you, because on page 2, you're going to be able to jot down some important information that might come in handy when you take the assessment at the end.
Well, we were with Dr. Marilyn Friend, and she is a CEC past president. Welcome.
Thank you.
So you specialize in co-teaching. Could you first let us know what are some challenges in co-teaching?
Co-teaching has been around for 30 years now, and at the beginning it had such intuitive appeal. What could be challenging about a general ed teacher and a special ed teacher sharing a classroom and making sure they address student needs? And we've all learned over those years that it's really a lot more than that, and a number of challenges have arisen. For example, probably the first one, and that makes or breaks many programs, is administrative understanding. Because if school administrators don't deeply understand what co-teaching requires and how it's done effectively, it's not sustainable. In addition, there are very practical matters. The most common concern about co-teaching isn't really about what goes on in the classroom. It's about the need for common planning time. And while electronic options certainly are driving a new way to plan for co-teaching, many teachers still find that they have almost no planning time, and that makes it very difficult to do this. Now, there are all kinds of other challenges, of course, professional development and making sure that classrooms are set up correctly. But if we could work with having administrators understand, and if we could make sure teachers could work together away from the children, I think we'd be in much better shape.
Sure. So that all being said, then what are some strategies for effective co-teaching?
Yeah. And that's the companion, of course, to
Yes.
the first question. And when I think about co-teaching, I would say that there are a number of critical components. And the complexity is that those components are interlocking, but they're also all always moving. The first one is that teachers need to have an understanding of their roles and responsibilities. General ed teachers are responsible for the general curriculum. Special educators are responsible for the special ed students and the services that they need. That has to be in place. Second, there are 6 fundamental co-teaching approaches that most people know now. Unfortunately, sometimes in a classroom, what teachers know and what's implemented are not the same thing. And too often now, co-teaching is one teach, one assist, which is inappropriate. A third piece is just classroom logistics. How do you have students in small groups with 2 teachers and move them efficiently? That also is an issue. And then the most important one is the instruction that goes on that classroom. Because if students with disabilities don't receive specially designed instruction, they're not getting what they're supposed to get.
So why is it important for teachers to be able to co-teach?
Now, the promise of co-teaching is really about a dual goal. The first part of the goal is to provide students with disabilities meaningful access to the general curriculum in the preferred least restrictive environment, which is with their peers. The simultaneous goal is that they will receive while there the specially designed instruction to which they are entitled.
And so why is it overall better for the teachers and the students?
Yeah. For the students, we know that while co-teaching, I think, should be implemented more with children with high needs, students with disabilities, nearly all of them are capable of learning the same curriculum if they receive the right type of specialized instruction. And so for students, if co-teaching is implemented with fidelity, students have a great potential to really achieve the standards that are expected in today's schools and to really have that success. For teachers, this is a reflection of the real world in the 21st century. Most people now work on teams. We know the problems are too complex. No one person can possibly know all the answers. And so co-teaching is also an opportunity for collaboration where teachers put their heads together, and it's a very supported feeling. And many teachers say that they're better teachers because they've co-taught.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Friend, so much for sharing with us the benefits and the challenges of co-teaching.
Glad to do so.
Wow. Dr. Marilyn Friend says a lot in that short 5-minute video, but all of it is so crucial. She talks a little bit about the problems with co-planning, not having enough time to actually do this, but also about how ineffective the one teach, one assist is. And then, like I said, Misty will be really diving deeply into the purpose of having a special education teacher in the classroom working with a general education teacher is to provide that specially designed instruction. A lot of information. But I guess at the very end, we want to make sure that we think this really is an opportunity. It's a good thing to be able to put two heads together and solve the problems and help each other out. So that's why we need to be thinking, how can we enrich this co-teaching environment if we've already been working in one, or how can we start one? On page 2, if we think about starting, how do we know if we're ready? The state task group, the high school state task group actually developed this readiness checklist. And so it is a great way for you to actually open a conversation up with your administration as well as your other team members if you're thinking about starting a co-teaching team. What about the culture? What about scheduling? What about planning? What about delivering and the growth of the students? So take some time. This is a link that is provided within your handout, the welcome page. There's a link that says Inclusive Practice Readiness Checklist that is in the co-teaching section. Take some time to actually do this and then see how many yes and not yet you have. And then let's focus on building up some supports so that they're all yeses. It's time now for your second password code phrase, parity signals. Write that down, parity signals. So let's take some time now, turn to page 3, roles and responsibilities. We're going to do an activity where we're going to brainstorm. We're going to list down, and hopefully we will debunk some misconceptions. General education teachers, you're going to write down what are your current roles and responsibilities, big picture. And the special education teachers, same thing. What are your current roles and responsibilities? 4 bullets might not be enough, so you might write down a lot more. But then I want you then to take the time, if you are the gen ed teacher, then you're going to write down what do you believe, or maybe you know, what are the special education teachers' roles and responsibilities. List down what you think they're responsible for. And then the same thing, special education teachers, write down what you believe the gen ed teachers' roles and responsibilities are. Hit pause, and we'll be back in a little bit to list just some of the primary roles and responsibilities. Okay, now that you're back, let's think. If we're a general education teacher, let's talk about what is your big win? What do you bring to the table each time? You are the content specialist. So that means you know your standards. You are planning most of the curriculum. You are creating those learning targets. Your pacing guide is aligned to the academic standards. This is the wheelhouse you work in all the time. When we think of macro planning, the big picture, what are the big bullets in each one of the units? So you'll have the outline set up so that you can have these conversations. And we'll talk about this macro planning in a lot more detail later on. But the weekly lesson plans, they need to be shared with the special education teacher for documentation, and we say transparency, so that everyone knows what the goal is. And Misty will talk a lot about how we use this information for creating the specially designed instruction. The other piece is that this macro planning and the weekly lesson plans will help us determine which delivery model in the co-teaching, whether it's alternative teaching, station teaching, would best fit the instruction to move students forward. And then general education teachers' role is to support the specially designed instruction after the initial delivery, so that we can then replicate this specially designed instruction with other students that might be struggling, but also to provide for the generalization of targeted skills and behavior in the general education environment. So keep in mind that this really is or the big rocks and roles and responsibilities. So now let's look at, on page 3, also the roles and responsibilities, this big rocks for our special education teachers. The primary role is to deliver this specially designed instruction, SDI, specially designed instruction. That is their reason for being in that co-taught classroom. They are to plan it, and that takes time. They are to deliver it. They are to carefully document it. They are to systematically evaluate, is it working? Because this is all part of this specially designed instruction cycle. They are to adjust it based on data. So that's a big chunk of their roles and responsibilities. And if you are a gen ed teacher and you didn't realize that this is all going on, or you have no idea how they're doing this, then there could be some resentment building if you're thinking, I'm doing all of this and you're doing what? I'm not sure what you're doing. There can be a bit of resentment that happens when we don't know each other's role. So keep in mind that it's an important piece. So if we look at the second big rock, this is kind of a big rock. Special education teachers in the general education setting, remember, they're there to deliver the SDI. They're not there to be a second general education teacher. Everyone brings to the table their unique set of expertise. So we have our general education teacher, which is the content specialist. We have our special education teacher, which is what we call sometimes our strategy specialist or access specialist. When we talk about access, kind of like the differentiation. If we have these two wonderful specialists there, then we have this partnership that will build the best learning environment for our students. So let's go back and revisit this definition we talked about earlier from Teaching Exceptional Children, where co-teaching is this instructional delivery model where we have two teachers in the classroom teaching, working with the students. General education teachers and special education teachers are sharing this responsibility. But why in the math classroom? Why in a secondary math classroom is this so important? Let's just take a little bit. We're going to revisit this benefits of co-teaching in the secondary math classroom article. We have content specialists, the content teachers, the general education teachers. They have a wealth of knowledge and they have taken a lot of coursework so that they understand the content. Unfortunately, on the flip side of that is that as you're filling up your course schedule and you're taking all your content classes, you are limiting the number of coursework or classes that will focus on how to meet the needs of students with disabilities. When you're talking about special education teachers, though, they're the opposite of you. So they fill in, they complement you, where they have limited knowledge in the content. So we are trying to create the best learning environment for students where we bring in both special education teachers and general education teachers to share the roles and responsibilities for teaching all students. In the old days, it seemed to be this model. Rather than co-teaching, I love this. This came from the same article. Rather than it really being a co-teaching, they're really doing a shared co-assignment of the classroom. That is where one teacher really has the classroom and the other teacher, the special education teacher, can come in and spot check, manage the students, but not really be responsible for engaging in station work or parallel teaching. And so because of this lack of time to discuss really in-depth mathematics, what are the big rocks of this unit? This is that macro planning we'll talk about a little bit later. They are constantly just reacting to the lesson. So to prevent us from flying by the seat of our pants and planning on the fly, we're going to actually be thinking about how we can address these questions. Instead of asking ourselves, what's the plan for today and winging it, we're going to actually create a plan that will help us plan for the week, as well as for the unit, as well as maybe for the entire year. In the co-teaching resource of that co-teaching welcome page, there's also another resource that we recommend. It's called the Co-Teachers Playbook. It is what it takes to make co-teaching work for everyone. And there's an activity that we've adapted from the playbook. So what we'd like you to do is on page 3, fill in the blanks of what you believe are the do's and don'ts. So I'm just going to give you an example. The do's and don'ts. The first line says, don't show up late. So you're going to fill in late. Complain about the students or the educators. We never, ever, ever want to be tearing down our educators. We want to be supporting and building them up. What we want to do is be early. So fill in early or on time with prepared materials needed to plan. And you need to be staying positive. Okay. Now take some time, hit pause, fill in the other pieces, and then we'll come back and we'll look at the answer. If you need more time, then go ahead and hit pause and then come back. So let's look now at what the responses, the do's and the don'ts. Don't allow people to pop in. You might have said something very similar to that. We complain about our number one barrier to successfully implementing co-teaching is time, then we can't allow people to pop in during your meeting. That is precious time. Safeguard it. Put a do not disturb sign on the door, go to a different location, make sure that people know that this is the time and that you're already being there early, you're already staying positive. Now let's safeguard the time. We don't want to deviate from the agenda and use non-fact-based statements, because part of what we're doing is we're evaluating whether the specially designed instruction, how are students doing. If we're evaluating how the students are performing, then we need to make sure that we bring the facts. So we want to stay focused using data and work samples to guide our work. We need to make sure that we don't forget to write things down. So we need to make sure that we keep track of official minutes so that we can share them not only with others on our team, but to look back sometimes when we're having parent conferences. As well as do not continue to meet with students while they're in the hallway when the time is up. You've set aside this time, you've utilized it, make sure that you end on time or a few minutes early so that you are back in that classroom ready to deliver the instruction at the appropriate time. And then in this day and age, we have technology that reminds us we've got 5 minutes left. Let's wrap it up. Earlier, we talked about macro planning. And so we're going to move a little bit into this planning piece where we give you a sample of what this BASE model looks like. Here's an example. You have this link actually in that welcome page. But BASE stands for Big Ideas, Analyzing Difficulties, Strategies and Supports, and Evaluation. And so a group of math teachers thought, how can we help our team? And so this was developed by a group of math teachers, and then it was honed in and then shared with quite a few different publications because it was so successful. As a general education teacher, you're going to be thinking about your unit, and you're going to be listing the big ideas of a unit. So this is a unit, a middle school statistics unit. And you're going to list all the big ideas. But then what you're going to do with your special education teacher and the general education teacher sitting together, thinking about what are the big areas of difficulties within these units. And so this is where both of your expertise will help bridge the gap. And then you're going to talk about what are the best learning strategies. So the content specialist might list, here are some of the things that I, would bring to the table. And then all of a sudden you've got your strategy specialist coming in saying, well, I also think that this is, a way for us to actually deliver the instruction. Then after the delivery, you're going to evaluate. Then you're just going to jot notes down. If students still struggled, did you add additional strategies? You'll jot those down as well. The first year might be a struggle, but once you actually start getting into the routine of this will help you have a roadmap for every unit that you're working with. It's going to take some time, but remember that you are planning to plan. We also created some templates and put them in as links as well, that your special education teacher and your general education teachers are working together and they have a big picture. And this is so crucial when they're thinking about when special education teachers are trying to design what strategies supports they're going to bring to the table in your classroom in a professional manner. They need to have the big picture ahead of them. Otherwise, again, they're going to be winging it. And that's not going to help you, the students, the parents. It needs to be a collaborative effort. And the reason being, again, is going back to specially designed instruction. The co-teaching is about carefully planning and document. That's part of it. And so we need to be having these conversations about what are the appropriate SDIs, ways to incorporate them in the lessons, how we're collecting data, and having this unit plan ahead of time so that we can set the best plan in place. After we do the macro planning, then it's down to the weekly lesson plans. We created an environment in our weekly lesson plans that house this information. Together as a team, we can create the best learning environment for all. So remember, purposely planning it, delivering, and documenting it is part of it. If we focus adding this section to our lesson plans, whatever our lesson plan template is, we can easily add a co-teaching column and a specially designed instruction column. Remember that we're really focusing on eliminating the one teach and one assist, and maybe only using that if we have a substitute in the building where they aren't privy to the entire weekly lesson plans and the big goal. So keep that in mind, that can be one that is used, but it is the most ineffective one and the most inappropriate one if we're talking about increasing engagement and opportunities to respond and giving feedback. The other one that we're going to be using periodically is one teach, one observe. And sometimes the one observe model in those articles that I referred to earlier, where they talk about the one teach, one observe, is sometimes that model that is used at the very beginning of the year when we're getting to know our students and when we're observing the effectiveness of a specially designed instruction. So keep that in mind. This link is also there, this template. This came from Dr. Marilyn Friend. She recognizes this is a powerful planning tool so that we avoid teaching on the fly. So I ask you just to go back and reflect on these questions. What would you say if your administration or a teacher, another teacher, or a parent asks you these questions? What SDIs are you or your collaborating teacher using? If you don't know what the SDI is, then that's a conversation that needs to be happening. Well, which IEP goals or learning characteristics is the SDI addressing? Remember, we're talking about this co-teaching team, and these conversations should be happening during the macro planning. Well, how effective is the SDI currently being implemented? How is it being documented? And what evidence do you have that you are systematically delivering this specially designed instruction? Both the gen ed and the special education teacher need to be having conversations so that no one is caught off. So how do we get better? How do we get better at planning? How do we get better at using the tools that we have in front of us? Well, in a document that actually was shared with us at the CEC conference in 2019, Common Co-Teaching Challenges, there are ways to address them. Dr. Marilyn Friend gives multiple examples, and I'm going to share some of the topics that are in this document. I think that this is wonderful for teachers, whether you're gen ed or special education teachers, as well as administrators, instructional coaches, because this has answers to questions from Dr. Marilyn Friend that we might have throughout the year. Co-teaching teams establish electronic shared workspace. Dr. Marilyn Friend talks about the general education teachers. Her recommendation is to upload your lesson plans 3 to 5 days prior to the actual delivery date. So, you might be thinking, I need to have my planning day on Tuesday for the following week. And here's why. We need to allow time for both teachers to create the lesson plans. But then if we don't have time where we're working together, then the general education teacher can share them with the special education teacher so they can annotate to them what specially designed instruction is happening that week, as well as that shared conversation of what co-teaching model best fits for the type of lesson plans that you have this week. So we need to be having time to actually make changes so that the final lesson plans have been negotiated to meet the needs of everyone. She also talks about, within this document, different ways, ideas for the 60-minute co-planning protocol, ideas for finding common planning time, which I think, we all need, sometimes just to think outside the box. But as you can read through, I'll give you time just to read through. Planning, whether it is face-to-face, whether it's electronic, on-the-spot planning, it's about planning. It's about having those conversations. So now let's take a step back, and we're going to revisit the co-teaching models. We're going to do an activity because we've given you a little time for getting. Dr. Archer always talks about retrieval practices, and we gave you a little time to forget. So now we're going to go back and think about those 4 models that we talked about: the parallel teaching, team teaching, station teaching, and alternate teaching. Those are an important piece of our learning intention today. And we're going to see, can you recall what the definition for each one of the models is? And we're going to do some sorting, but it's going to be sorting online, so it's a little different than if we were face-to-face. So let's use our technology to create this environment for recall or retrieval practice. So here are the cards. You can hit pause while you're sorting them, but you're going to be taking and you're going to be looking at which diagram matches each of the different types of models and then what definition goes with it. This is what it would look like as you document it on your guided notes. On page 3, you're going to record your answers so that in your mind you might actually put D3 together. Okay, so you'll pause your video and you'll sort them. You do not have to draw these out. So what you're going to look at something like this. This is what you'll probably write down. That would be the easiest way to document it. So ABCs across the first row, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 on the second. So hit pause. So let's check your work. This is what it should look like. So you should have station teaching, and it would be D3. We just talked about that. We gave you that first one. Parallel teaching, definition is number 1. Alternative teaching, which is C diagram, goes with 2 and A4. Now, I went ahead and filled this out for you so that you would actually have it as it looks on your actual guided notes. What I want you also now to do is actually take some time to write down, if you're working in your math classroom, what type of station teaching could you be doing? And list some examples. Another resource that we've included for you is actually the co-teaching planning ideas and examples that came from Dr. Maren Friend. The part that we focus on here is when to use each one of these models. So you have that to reflect on as well. So let's take a little bit of time now to do a little true and false questions. You must decide on co-teaching model and use that same model for the entire lesson. Is it true or is it false? Okay, false. What we really want to do is make sure that as you look at the lesson and how, depending on how much time you have, you might have a 90-minute class period. And so you might be switching up the co-teaching models. You might be using parallel teaching, and then you might switch to team teaching. You might be switching to station teaching. As we're ending today, I want to make sure that you have the copy of this, that you keep this saved to your desktop, because there are so much information within this. And I told you that I would refer to the different topics they talk about: class composition, separate settings for students with disabilities. How about behavior, disappointing student achievement? That's more focused on that first year. Co-teaching and specially designed instruction. We talk about the special education expertise in those content areas. There are multiple areas, so just take some time to read through them. Remember, this is a journey. It's one step at a time. You're going to start, and our hope is that you start thinking about, how do I identify one structure and one STI with your team to implement in that co-teaching setting within the next 2 weeks. Doesn't matter who starts it, as long as we start working in that same direction. And here we are at the end. So check mark, we've gone through the co-teaching model. Go back, revisit it, replay it. You'll have enough time to hit some of the other pieces again. Go back and look at the macro planning, the lesson plans. You have all these resources at your fingertips now. And keep your guided notes next to you as you're taking the assessment at the end, because there will be some questions that are content specific. Thank you for your time today. It's been a pleasure to work with you and to facilitate this session. Your next step is to download those guided notes for specially designed instruction, and Misty will be joining you shortly.